Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. In today's episode, Steve Durbin and I close out our Authors Roundtable season by discussing what we've learned from our interviews over the past 4 episodes with Tom Eisenman, Michelle Walker, Michelle Seiler Tucker, and Matt Bloomberg, and how those conversations can inform cybersecurity professionals. Steve, we have just wrapped up our season, which has been a really interesting shift for us. We've never had 4 authors on, or a number of authors. So this has been a really interesting season, the Authors Roundtable. And I wanted to come back into conversation with you today to look back at these last 4 episodes with leading experts, all with new books out, all about business, and review what we learned from each of those conversations, and also more directly and more strongly link those conversations to our unique cybersecurity listeners. So what I thought we might do is just take one conversation at a time and review it, and I would like to ask you to help make that link so that these conversations are not just beneficial in and of themselves, but so that our listeners can understand the links across the 4 and the links to their own concerns of security today. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think that is the way to do it, Tavia. I think that, one of the things I'm always struck by in security and talking to people in that specific line of business, but also in businesses in general, is just how much we can always learn from different elements that people are engaged in. And so I think, if we looked at these 4 authors, and we've never done it before, we've never taken 4 authors and sort of delved into that in some way. But if we take it at a sort of superficial level, you could sort of say, well, what's the linkage here? But for me, actually, the linkage is really clear. So, we start with Tom Eisenman, and he really looked into why startups fail. This tremendous amount of experience that he brings to that podcast. And for me, the linkage there is a lot of security departments are actually startups.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that security is still a very young business. Cybersecurity is very, very young. We often think of it in, it's been around forever. It hasn't. And I think that for a lot of organizations, certainly if we look at the sort of mid to smaller end of the market, who, let's face it, are really key targets for a lot of cyber criminals, there hasn't been either, some would say the focus, I would say the resource, to really implement best in breed security. So they're almost in catch up. So that's what I mean by saying they're startups. They're just beginning. Right. They're setting out on that journey. And so they do have some of those challenges that Tom talks about. How do you get a business going? How do you build momentum? How do you get people interested in what you're bringing to the market? How do you really invigorate people who are having to touch the different elements that you're bringing to them? And how do you cope with change? Because any startup is there to disrupt in some way, shape, or form. And I know that disruption isn't the theme of this particular series, but it is of our next one. And so I think there's a nice little link there too. So for me, I think, if you listen to Tom's podcast, if you go further, if you read his book, tremendous amount of learnings there that we can apply into some of those more early stage security departments that are being set up in different organizations from one day to the next.
That's a really interesting point, and I think that is very useful to think of, even if you are running an enterprise that is generations old. Or I think about Dame Inga Beale, who we've had on, and Lloyd's of London, such a long history in that enterprise. But having a startup mentality within the security sector of that business and understanding how it is like a startup, that's very useful.
It is, and I think particularly in terms of some of the communication that's required, the transparency, the continual communication with the market. And if you're in a security department, of course, that's everybody across the enterprise that you're serving, and beyond that, because of course you're having to deal with third parties as well. And so there are some really strong lessons, I think, that Tom brings to that particular area that we can all learn from, irrespective of which department we're in. And I do think there's some really good insights there for CISOs.
I agree. And I wonder also, not just for people in the C-suite, but for the board to think of security, the startup definition or mentality of security. If that would help them make the bridge to embracing security, understanding the role of security in a different way?
Yeah, I think it may well do. I think, one of the questions that security people are always asked is how do they demonstrate a return on investment? And that's not to say that startups don't do that. But of course, if you think about most startups, they go through a period where they don't make money,
Mm-hmm.
where you are investing. And then suddenly one day the light bulb goes on and off we go. And I think the same applies to security in a slightly different way, of course, because what in security you're trying to do is to protect the organization. You never know when you'll get a return on that. And actually, maybe you shouldn't, because to being able to demonstrate a return on it is taking you probably down the wrong road. It's more about, I think, making sure that the business is best equipped to deliver a return on investment in the areas that should be doing that: marketing, sales. Security provides the functional, the operational ability to do that securely, so that you're not losing intellectual property, you're not wasting R&D dollars and euros and pounds, that you are best equipped for what the future will bring to the organization. And again, when we think about it from that perspective, that's a startup mentality. You're trying to future proof the organization, you're trying to bring value. And I think that, more CISOs, more boards, more CEOs could benefit from looking at it that way.
That's a really interesting point, that other areas have a return on investment because they've been
Yeah,
enabled to have that
absolutely.
by security.
Absolutely. I mean, security is an enabler. We have to, I think, mind shift. We've seen it as being something that, prevents bad things happening. It isn't. It's something that enables an organization to outperform the competition, because it enables the business to operate more securely and with confidence. And that's certainly something that I think successful businesses coming out of the pandemic are going to need more than anything else.
Let's shift to looking back at our conversation with Michelle Wucker, who's best known for The Gray Rhino: How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore.
Yeah.
And her most recent book, You Are What You Risk: The New Art and Science of Navigating an Uncertain World. She was our second episode, and so I think this is a good shift to talking about organizations' comfort with risk, necessity of looking risk in the face, being honest, assessing. So tell us what you took from the conversation with Michelle Wucker.
I think this one is probably a little closer to security. It isn't such a big leap, because we are talking about risk. And as you know, I always talk about the fact that for me, security these days is all about risk. It's all about risk management. It's about understanding risk. It's about having conversations around risk appetite with the business and behaving, adapting accordingly. So I think Michelle was on, from our point of view anyway, from the security standpoint, we were on much safer ground here because we were talking about something that people could relate to. And, when we dig into risk in a bit more detail, one of the things I find fascinating about it is, for a lot of other parts of businesses, it's something that we have done without really thinking. If you're a sales leader, for instance, you will be taking risks every day of your life. I mean, that's it. That's what you do. It's about risk management. If we think about traditional enterprise risk, set security aside for one moment, businesses have been used to having risk departments. It's been built in from the outset. And so I think that the linkage then between cybersecurity and to enterprise risk becomes almost quite natural. What for me is interesting, though, is the way in which the whole approach to risk is evolving. And if I look at what we're doing just from an ISF standpoint, we've had for a number of years now the ability for members to assess their risk using some of our tools, most of which have been, or all of which until fairly recently, have been qualitative. So qualitative risk assessment. And for members listening, that's IRAM and more recently IRAM2. But we're also now introducing quantitative risk methodologies and approaches. And very often, I get asked the question of, does that mean that qualitative is dead, and is it, long live quantitative? And the answer is that in the world of risk, you have to really make use of the most appropriate methodologies, approaches to assessing risk on their own merits. So you will, for instance, in certain instances, want to take a very qualitative approach to it. In others, you will want to drill down very specifically into the costs associated and the cost of perhaps implementing systems, approaches, and so on, because you do want to look at it from a return on investment standpoint. You do want to justify spend. And what Michelle is talking about is not at that level, of course, but she's talking about trying to look outside of both of those to provide the context. So from an ISF standpoint, what we do is provide you with the tools, the approaches, and the methodology. What she's talking about then is the way in which that can be taken into this much broader overall context, and to not be afraid to step outside of the traditional. So don't just look at the way in which a particular risk is viewed. Add things together. We've talked about that as well, risks combining. Think about our threat horizon report.
Right.
That's all about not just individual threats, but the way in which they combine. And so I think that some of Michelle's insights there are really instructive into how we can think about combinations, think about different elements of risk that perhaps we wouldn't normally be considering. And again, one of the things that I took away from it was that that's probably the starting point. And all too often, of course, what we do is we dive to the methodology. I need to assess risk. Okay, we'll give you a methodology for doing it. If you're in the ISF, it'll be KIRA or IRAP. It could be FAIR. It could be a whole range of other things that are out there. But what Michelle is talking about is stepping back and saying, hang on a minute, let's just look at the overall context, the overall landscape of risk, and then make an assessment, and then decide what approach you're going to take to really drilling down and evaluating that. And why do you look at risk? Well, it's so that you can avoid making mistakes. It's so that you have a plan in place to deal with things going wrong. And so for me, it's about that standing back, taking a breath, looking at the overall context, adding different things together, playing out some of these things before you dive into this is the methodology and this is the approach for me. So I thought that was a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed that one very much.
Is it fair to make a link between what you've shared in this glance back at the conversation and link it to security not being just the security department's job, but security being everybody's responsibility? When you're talking about assessing risk holistically or looking outside of certain parameters, is that a link we can make as well?
I think it is. And I think that, if you roll things forward far enough, for me, security, and again, I've said this very often, security for me just disappears. If you think about health and safety, for instance, we don't spend a huge amount of time agonizing over whether or not we should comply with health and safety regulations. We just do it. It's built into the way that, businesses operate. And security eventually, I believe, will become the same because it's all about balancing risk. So yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Let's turn our attention to Michelle Seiler Tucker. Interesting conversation based around her new book, Exit Rich, the 6P Method to Sell Your Business for a Huge Profit. And she's a specialist in mergers and acquisitions. Tell us what your main takeaway from that conversation was, or takeaways, and also help us link that more thoroughly into the security space.
This, for me, works on two levels. And I thought it was really interesting just to hear her perspective. So the two levels for me, the first is the role that security has to play in supporting M&A activity. But the second thing is really, and again, it's a little bit like I was saying with Tom Eisenman's, it's about getting security into the right shape so that somebody wants it. So if you look at the first one, the role of security in M&A, I think I make the point with Michelle that I've worked in M&A for many years, and very, very rarely did I ever want to go near a security person. The fear was they would always slow it down. They'd always stop things. They always find, problems. And actually, most M&A activity is done on company valuation. Well, if you think about where we're at today now, well, cybersecurity has an impact on company valuation. Yeah. And we've seen that. We've seen Marriott and Sheraton, for instance, the due diligence was not to the level that was sufficient to identify an inherent problem that then came about after Marriott had bought Sheraton. And that's just one example. There are many others out there where we've seen, valuations that have taken a tumble because they've missed things or they haven't looked at them. So there's a sort of inherent frustration, I think, with security people that they're not involved sufficiently early in that overall M&A process. And that's something that has to change. Because if we're talking about every organization being cyber enabled, then if you're buying another organization, you need to do your due diligence on the way in which cyber is managed in that organization. And more importantly, how are you going to pull the two things together? We've done it with technology, IT. Cyber is just the next step on for that. But cyber has the potential to really bring things to a grinding halt and have a very significant impact on valuations. So I think that, again, it's about maturing, and the industry is maturing. We are getting there, but we're probably not getting there quickly enough. So I think that, the point for me around M&A is that if anybody listening to this is considering any M&A activity, just ask the question, have we actually looked at cyber? Have we involved the security department, if we've got one? Or have we had a security audit done? So that's one element of it. The second one, though, is for me a little bit more interesting, because it is about, what do you want to do? You want to make yourself look as attractive as possible for somebody to come and buy you
Mm-hmm.
or to merge with you or whatever it is. And so some of the things that Michelle talks about in terms of getting the business to that point where you're really attractive, I think can be picked up and taken into the world of security, because what security has to do is make itself look attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And like it or not, we're coming from a position where we have been viewed as the traffic cops, the know people.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've talked about this with a number of different people over the various series that we've been running over the years, and it's still a problem. So I think that, listening to some of the things that Michelle talks about in terms of getting yourself ready for acquisition, making yourself look attractive, getting your house in order, all of those sorts of things, those are really good instructive pieces for any CISO that's out there thinking about how he or she can improve the perception in the business of their
Mm-hmm.
department, and perhaps some of the things they need to do to improve that. So yeah, I think that for me is the linkage there.
Mm-hmm. One thing that's so apparent is that if you follow every step of Michelle's roadmap or all of the areas that she invites leaders to pay attention to, you can have a beautifully organized, high value business. If security is lacking, you're so undermining the value.
Mhm.
It cannot be an afterthought. In the way, she talks about leaders who have businesses where the assets are in their head.
That's right.
It's relying on one person. And I thought that was an interesting link as well, that you can't hold things, you have to organize information, you have to share information. Everybody has to be on the same page. And that in security is key, as we've discussed, as you said, for so many years.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if you are going to take some of these thoughts out of people's heads, you have to protect it because it's got value. And again, that's the role of security. So I think there's so many different jumping off points for security people to sort of think things through, but it requires, I think, for you to take a slightly different approach to the way that you view your role, your department, perhaps, because you are, and security people very often pull me up on this. They hate me referring to them in this way, but as an industry, we have to become better at selling.
Mm-hmm.
We have to sell ourselves, our ideas, our concepts within the organization. And as I say, there will be people listening to this who will probably switch off at this point, thinking, here he goes again. But it's true. We have to get those messages across. And traditionally, we haven't been very good at it. And so I think some really good lessons that can be learned, I think, from Michelle in terms of the advice she gives to people who are trying to make, in the main, I think, life-changing decisions.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I enjoyed about Michelle is that she's inviting creative thinking into M&A. So, and listeners will enjoy her, if you have a restaurant, don't just have a restaurant, sell cookbooks or sell hot sauce, or it's creative thinking. And I think that you are always thinking creatively about cybersecurity, about how and why, but also where it sits in a business. And that's the very nature of our podcast. We are trying to offer creative new ways of approaching cybersecurity, that it's not just siloed, it's not just black and white information or ones and zeros. It is creative. We do need to sell those ideas, be able to communicate well, bring people on board, make people feel the spirit of the importance, and be collaborative in supporting security. So I like this author series because these are all creative people and it fits with the Creative ISF podcast as well.
Yeah, I think that if you step back, if you look at what you try to do in security, You actually are in a people business
Mm.
because you have to interact to get your message across. You have to take into account that people are going to, irrespective of what policy you put in place, are going to behave in a way that they deem appropriate and you may deem inappropriate from time to time. And you're going to have to persuade people to change. So these are all, soft skills. And we talked about this in some of our other podcasts too. But for me, the need for really effective soft skills in the industry has never been more relevant, never been more important. And that is something I think that will continue. That's not going to go away anytime soon. But again, I see that as the industry just maturing,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that has happened with lots of others as well. And one of the things that is very different now, of course, is that you put technology, access to data, and therefore the need for security into the hands of pretty much every single employee that you have, irrespective of where they happen to be. And so you have to be very good at getting those messages across. Awareness has never been more important. You cannot simply impose policies and constraints as an effective means of ensuring security across your business anymore. The pandemic put an end to that,
Mm-hmm.
if it hadn't ended already.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do then have to think about things afresh. And so some of the ways in which these authors are coming at things, yes, it is. It's very creative. It's because it has to be creative,
Right.
because the industry is not moving slowly anymore. It's very, very fast. I mean, I always talk about, the need for agility, the fact that this is one of the most exciting spaces that anyone can work in at the moment. And that's true. It is. But the image
Mm.
is quite often very different in certain instances. And so bringing some of this fresh creative thinking to it, and the way in which we can then go forward, in our different enterprises, and the way in which we work collaboratively with third parties and so on, I think is really fundamental.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great lead into looking back at our last conversation with Matt Blumberg, who is the author of Startup CEO and his new release, Startup CXO, a field guide to scaling up your company's critical functions and teams. So we're in a people business, you say.
Mm-hmm.
This is a great book to discuss. This is all about the people. Tell us what you took away from that conversation.
For me, there is just, this is a book that people should read. And the reason for it is really simple. What Matt does, and it's not just Matt who writes it, there's a number of different authors in there writing different pieces of it. But what they do is they try to give you insight into the different functional leaders in the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's just think about that for a moment. So I'm the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. I'm there trying to work with all of these other people. I maybe have access to the board. I don't know them necessarily. It may be a new level of access that I'm getting. Well, what Matt does is walk you through the different functions. What does the marketing guy do on a day-to-day basis? The more I think that we can understand how different leaders within the business operate, their needs, the better equipped we are from a security standpoint to be able to meet those needs and have the conversation with them from a position of understanding and knowledge rather than anything else. And he does include one section in there as well in terms of privacy, which, as we discussed on the podcast, should probably have been security, but maybe he'll change it in the next version. I
Right.
don't know. But it is a bit of a security how-to for me. Get that understanding, if you don't have it already, of how the whole business comes together, because then you're going to be in a much, much more powerful position to be able to make your case. And, let's face it, work collaboratively with your co-leaders to make a difference.
And also, hopefully, it would be reciprocal for people who are interested in Startup CXO and understanding critical functions and teams. The opportunity is there for the CEO, the CFO, everybody to better understand the CISO's roles and how to support him or her.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's the ideal situation that you find yourself in. If you have a team that's working well, everybody does appreciate what each different leader is up against, and the job they're trying to do. And that just fosters collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is the position that we need to be getting to. And really important, I think, from a security standpoint, because all too often the heat tends to rise as far as security is concerned, because either something has been breached, something's been lost, or there's a policy that people don't agree with, or awareness isn't working, all of these sorts of things. And in those situations, you really need to have solid relationships with your peer group to be able to get through some of the things that need to happen to enable change and to really be for the good of the organization. But again, comes back to communication, comes back to change, comes back to people.
I really like the idea that we're ending this series talking about teams because, as you pointed out, so often the security team has been viewed as a traffic cop or obstructive, and reorganizing the thinking of the entire team to recognize the collaboration, the value of collaboration, supporting each other's work, enabling each other's work. And we've referenced the marketing person, but the marketing person in an enterprise with a great security team and great security is going to be more successful at marketing. They are not separate. They should not be siloed. What's good for security is good for marketing, vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's right. Security is something that flows through the business from the chairman right the way down.
Mm-hmm.
And organizations that get that and get it right are flourishing in a manner that is appropriately protecting their intellectual property, their core components, their core business, because that's how they view it. And I think those that are struggling are perhaps not benefiting from some of that at the moment. And this isn't deliberate. I don't know of any organization that's out there saying we're deliberately not going to spend on this. It's not that. It is more about, education. It is more about, I think, security doing a better job of getting the message across about the benefit that it can bring to some of the things we've just been talking about. And that's really why I enjoyed this particular Authors Roundtable series, because it was, different people from different sectors of business with creative stories to tell. And they all are applicable to the situation that we find ourselves in with security today and will do tomorrow.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this series too. I think we should consider maybe an annual Authors Roundtable series because books are coming out all the time that are on the leading edge of technology changes and social changes. So if we're in a people business, tracking what's on the cutting edge of change will be an interesting opportunity for us.
Somebody's bound to approach us, Tavia, from a publisher and ask us to write one.
Oh, I imagine. I'm fielding offers all the time.
They just need to form an orderly queue and we'll get to them.
That's right. That's right. Your name can be first.
Oh, that was a given.
Okay, good. Well, we've looked back at where we've been over the last several weeks. We're going to have a bit of a season break, but we'll come back with a new season on disruption. Do you want to give our listeners just a little clue into what's ahead in the coming weeks as we embark on a new series of conversations?
I'm looking forward to the Disruption series. We touch on some pretty dark areas, I think, in terms of the way that the world is changing from a security standpoint. But we also, are a little bit lighter and a little bit more upbeat when we talk about some of the things like artificial intelligence. We look at things like rogue waves, which that's one I'm really looking forward to. And people will have to obviously listen in to find out more about what I mean by that, as indeed so will I. But I think that, disruption is all around us. And what I think we're trying to do in this next series is to position it again, yes, from the security standpoint, but also more broadly than that, from a business standpoint, as to how we can identify some of the things that are happening ahead of time and view disruption as a positive. Positive disruption is the way of life for so many organizations. But it needs to be managed carefully, and that means you need to really understand what you're doing, and you need to be aware of some of the things that are happening across the whole landscape. And that's really what we tried to do in that short series.
Agreed. Well, we always come back to topics that keep you up at night, so we'll mix a couple of those in with a little more hopeful view. And I look forward to that, as always. We will be back with a bonus episode next week. Then we're going to take just a week's break, and we'll be back in a few weeks with this new series on disruption. And it promises to be a very fascinating series of conversations, as always.
I'm looking forward to it.
As am I. Thanks for being with us and walking us through that Authors Roundtable series, Steve. Great to see you, as always.
Nice to see you too.
That brings us to the close of the Authors Roundtable season of the ISF podcast. Thanks again to all of our guests and our listeners for sharing these fascinating conversations. Next week, we'll be back with a bonus episode, an encore presentation of an episode I mentioned today, Steve's Season 2 interview with Dame Inga Beale, former CEO of Lloyd's of London. Here's a preview of that bonus episode.
As the CEO, it can be very difficult sometimes to admit you got something wrong. It can be very difficult to admit you're anxious about something. But if you come out and declare that, you usually see huge benefits. People like it. They want to see you as being really authentic and genuine. And to show that vulnerability can be a wonderful leadership trait these days.
After we hear again from Dame Inga Beale in conversation with Steve Durbin, we'll take a week's break. Then we'll be back with the start of our next season, focusing on disruption. In the meantime, we would so appreciate it if you would consider writing a short review of our podcast. As I've said before, reviews really make a difference in helping us reach new listeners. So we thank you in advance. If there's a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know by getting in touch at securityforum.org. And while you're there, we invite you to explore our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. Follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.